Hello and welcome to my workshop. So today we'll be taking this VW Thing body I recently finished and putting a patina job on this along with a roll cage. What we're going to be doing is showing how to match a real life vehicle with the paint job and all the details. Alright, so let's get started. So the goal of this build isn't just to get a patina, but to match a real life example. I wanted to take on the challenge of accomplishing this as close as possible. After building out the body, I sanded and sprayed with filler primer. This gives a good base to start the build. I was trying to imagine the story behind the real example. I thought possibly the hood and engine were both salvaged from another thing, an orange one to be exact. This was done prior to giving a cheap respray of the teal color. So, my first task was to mask off the areas to paint the orange. Most of this will be covered up, but I wanted to build out the paint the same way I imagined the real thing had been. I try to keep the amount of tape down to a minimum by using this roll of painter's masking paper. It comes in different thicknesses and widths. I find this one to be my favorite though. I had some leftover paint from my UAZ 469. Luckily, I didn't need much, so it worked out great. Once it is dry, I pull off all the tape and paper and start spraying on the teal color. This paint is called iron lac and comes from Australia. The colors I'm able to find are really good, but there isn't a big supply unfortunately. After finishing up the bottom, I flip it over and paint the entire body. The next step is to work on the roll cage. It's a fairly simple one, but really ties the build together, as well as offers a lot of support for the windscreen. I start off with stainless steel tubing in my vise mounted bender. I just work back and forth until I get the angles just right. The hoop spreads across the body and ties into the floorboard with some scale metal supply tabs. This will be the basis for all the other tubes going forward and toward the rear. I find that simple hand tools like the hacksaw and file work best for me. I can quickly transition between my bender and clamping the material for a cut or notch. As mentioned, I'm going to the center hoop from the rear. I get a bend I like and then start working on the length. I just need to figure this out on one side, so I will just copy it to the other. Once the parts are cut and notched, I use the modular fixture table from Scale Metal Supplies to hold the pieces before brazing. The rear down leg of the cage can be bolted to the body and then brazed in situ to the center hoop. It's a little nerve-wracking to have a hot flame next to a finished plastic body, but if you take your time and pay attention, it will all work out just fine. The front windshield support is another story. The spot to braze is so close to the windshield, there's no way to do it in situ without melting the body. so I have to take my time to get the notch in the tube just right before I braze the brass U-channel in place. The next thing to get a coat of paint are the resin printed inner door skins. These slot into a vacuum formed piece to give the appearance of solid doors. The black gloves come out along with some soapy water. This is used to wet sand the seats first and then the body. I found that when I do a lot of wet sanding, my hands will start to crack and split. This is why I try to remember to always wear gloves. The wet sanding serves two purposes. The first is to get the body color as smooth as possible before applying the clear coat. The second is to wear down the paint so the colors underneath will show. This sanding technique does a decent job of replicating the sun-worn paint you often see on older vehicles. With the body prepped, I turn back to my story and focus on the next event. I envision a small fender bender, a shopping cart accident, or possibly a small pinhole of rust. This all happens years after the initial paint job has been completed. Instead of taking the time to find or match the original paint, some that was close enough was used. When I mask off the areas, I try and think about how the area would look at scale. So, instead of always using the sharp edge of the tape, I sometimes tear it lengthwise to make it a little jagged. Care is taken to reference back to the original as often as possible. I don't expect this to be exact, but to be very close and maybe more towards inspired. Once the tape and paper is applied, it goes into the paint booth for a similar color, but one that is obviously more blue than the green already applied. The seats also get a quick coat of black paint. The dash, which is a resin printed piece, gets a coat of body color before hand painting the details. As you can see, I now need my bifocals and my 5x magnifiers to see this detail and not have it come out looking like a third grader art piece. No offense to third graders. Most of the painted on detail is the dash pad and the knee pads. Many of the details are printed separate and glued into place after painting. I am not sure why I put myself through stressful things like this, but I do. The holes for the headlights need to be drilled. This, of course, has to be after I have spent hours on the paint job. Luckily, this all works out, and I am able to get the holes fitted to the headlight bezels. Small details like these hinges go on next. They are 3D resin printed and are just CA glued in place. I designed them with a small peg, which will be pushed into a hole drilled in the body. The original had some slight body damage to the front fender with a sloppily placed patch of Bondo. So I used my rotary tool to rough up the area a bit before applying some of the same stuff. I just try and spread it out as best I can and plan on leaving it just like that. The rotary tool is left out to cut small divots in key spots along the body. Some are to match rust spots I saw on the original, and some are just guesses as to where they would likely be rot on the body. I like to make the depressions to give texture, and to make it just look a little more realistic. Just having rust piled up on a pristine body doesn't sell well to the eye. The first step is to layer on different rust and brown tones. Most people don't realize just how orange rust is, so that is the key color to use. Once this is dry, rust effect paint is painted into the divots and allowed to dry. This paint reacts with an agent and will form real rust. Over time, it will get even better as the elements start to work on it. Some of the bits are chromed before being glued in place. I typically use Molotow in my airbrush, but I use mirror chrome when painting by hand. A few spots had some primer visible, where repair had been made but no attempt to add actual paint was taken. My first attempt was to airbrush this on, but the primer was just too light once it dried. It looked more like white paint than rattle can primer. So I just grabbed some rattle can primer and that did the trick. The interior sits on a base of black flocking. This is held in place with a very heavy coat of black spray paint before sprinkling on the flocking. The inner door skins get glued in place, and it's almost time to add in the seats. In the past, I have added cloth inserts to these, which is printed on a special paper. However, this one called for a much simpler seat, which was accomplished with just paint. The dash is the last piece to be glued in place before adding the roll cage. It just bolts down to the floor using the scale metal supply tabs. panel lines for the door look pretty good, casting their own shadows, due to being cut in with a Tamiya tool. I decided to enhance them with some brown and black wash. The bottle has a very small brush, which does a decent job. What I use instead is a fountain pen designed to dip in the ink. In this case, it holds a small amount of the wash, and the pinpoint allows for much more accurate application. No good scale vehicle will be complete without headlights and taillights. I get these installed by custom wiring in some LEDs with resistors. The value of the resistor is designed using ledcalc.com. You just input the voltages and desired milliamps, and it spits out a resistor with a simple wiring diagram. It's easy enough to manually calculate this, but the website makes it so much easier. I am super excited to get this finished. I know this will go to a good home and look forward to seeing it again. Until then, I'll see you on the rocks.